Good morning, everybody. This is Jerry Green. I am the senior fellow at the Pacific Council for the Middle East and South Asia, and I am delighted to welcome you to our webinar today. Unfortunately, our new CEO, Ambassador Christina Kvien, was going to moderate this, but she was called away. So I am the B team. Our speakers are not the B team, but your moderator is the B team. And I'm hoping you will all get a chance. I'm sure you'll all get a chance to meet Christina, who is fabulous. She's our former ambassador to Armenia, a former charge in Ukraine, very distinguished career, and really is helping to up our game considerably. And we were able to recruit both of our speakers today, in large part because Ambassador Kvien is well connected to her former colleagues. I want to alert everybody that today's session is on the record. It is being recorded. It will be accessible by YouTube. And as always, I will conversate with our guests, and then we will open it up to all of you for questions. So start preparing your questions. What's interesting about our webinar is Jonathan Shrier, who I will introduce in a second, is an expert on Israel, amongst other things. He's had a very distinguished diplomatic career and was deputy chief of mission in Israel for 3 years. So he is going to be our sort of Israel whisperer. I want to ask a lot of questions about Israel because we've really not talked a lot about that. And Alan Eyre, who again I will introduce in a second, is an expert on Iran. Even when there were a lot of experts on Iran in the State Department, there weren't that many experts on Iran in the State Department, and Alan Eyre is uniquely qualified there with a LA connection, which I'll mention to you. So Alan Eyre is now a distinguished diplomatic fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington, which is sort of the place where Middle East specialists like myself, or before I became a bureaucrat, turned to for insight and wisdom. He retired from the United States Foreign Service after a 40-year career in government, which is quite remarkable. He's a Middle East specialist with a focus on Iran. And his Iran story is really unique, not only in the State Department, but unique to me at least, is that he decided he wanted to learn Persian. He taught himself Persian. He then moved to Erangeles to do his field work. He could have had a Fulbright fellowship to LA to advance his studies in the Persian language. He was the sole career diplomat who was a member of the U.S. nuclear negotiating team during the JCPOA negotiations with Iran, and he was the team's subject matter expert. This, by the way, was the A team. The former president of MIT, the Secretary of Energy, was also a member of the negotiating team, which is kind of in contrast to later efforts where the level of expertise was perhaps calibrated differently. He was the first U.S. diplomat to serve in the political section of the U.S. Embassy in Kabul in 2001. He served in Nigeria, Syria, the UAE twice. Our Iran watching post is in Dubai. So if you're an Iran expert, serving in Dubai is the place to be. Azerbaijan, Jordan, and so forth. And he was the Persian language spokesperson for the U.S. Department of State, which is not only, I think, unprecedented, but really remarkable and important. And people wonder why the Iranians don't think well of us. One is our, limited able to interact and communicate with them. So having a Persian language spokesperson is really important. Jonathan Shrier is a former, again, U.S. Department of State diplomat, with more than 2 decades of experience across the State Department, the National Security Council, and service internationally worldwide. Most recently, he served at the UN as the U.S. Deputy Representative to the Economic and Social Council in New York from 2023 to 2025. And this was following service as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. I'm so used to saying Tel Aviv because the embassy was in Tel Aviv for so long, but it is in Jerusalem from 2019 to 2022. He served under three presidents and three ambassadors, Democrats and Republicans. And before that, he was the economic counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv. I am a huge fan of economic counselors because they actually understand things that political people like myself don't understand. And I was telling our new CEO, Christina Kveen, what a big deal it is that she's an economic officer, and she didn't realize that because it's within the State Department, it's all political stuff. So being an economic officer, our new CEO is a huge plus, a huge plus. He has served overseas in a number of positions, Consul General in Peshawar, which is a true adventure. Principal Deputy in Kabul, again, another adventure, and he coordinated multi-agency efforts supporting reconstruction and development. And he's also served in a number of positions in Washington, including working on global food security at state, which is a huge unrecognized issue for, most people don't realize the importance of food security, including in rich countries in the Gulf, for example, which people don't realize. He has served in Beijing and in a variety of other important positions. So, gentlemen, I want to welcome you both. I want to start, if I may, with Jonathan, and this is a sort of very broad-gauged question. Why is it that you think it is said that war is politics by another means? And Israel has been engaged in some significant military activities, engagements, which they have never recently managed to leverage into politically beneficial outcomes. There is massive destruction in Lebanon, Gaza. Hamas is still there, albeit in a new and diminished form. Iran, I don't fully understand. So what's the Israeli objective? What's the day after look like for Israel? The military and intel stuff, obviously they're really good at it. What's the political corollary to all of that at least I may be missing?
Yeah, so thanks, Jerry, for that kind introduction and for shortening my career by 10 years. I spent more than 3 decades serving in posts around the world, plus in the strange wilderness
Sorry,
of Washington.
we dropped the ball. If you can see this, it says 2 decades, but we yet again, the Pacific Council gets it wrong. I apologize. Sorry, I was reading. And no, I do. All. It's funny, it said 2 decades. And I thought,
it made me feel younger. It made me feel younger.
Yeah, it felt wrong to me, but anyway, I apologize. I'm sorry we got that wrong.
Not at all. But Israel's been marked by a struggle for survival since its establishment, the modern state of Israel. So upon the declaration of independence of Israel, 5 Arab armies came in from all sides, ended up occupying the area that was part of the British Mandate of Palestine, that is now referred to as the West Bank, and Egypt moved into Gaza, and so on, and borders then settled in 1948 with an armistice then, and then Israel has faced attacks since then, including famously the 6-Day War in 1967, where Israel pushed back against its Arab enemies and took control of the West Bank and Gaza, leading to a lot of as well as Sinai in Egypt, which had been Egypt. And that led to a lot of the subsequent efforts at building peace. And so the approach that Israel ultimately adopted, partly under U.S. pressure, was an idea of land for peace. And so that worked with Egypt, famously with the Camp David peace accords, which notably were under a Likud-led government. Likud is the right-wing party, the main right-wing party. So it's the mainstream. It's like traditional Republican Party thinking in the U.S. context. And so notably, the Camp David peace accords were under a Likud-led government. There was later a Labor-led government, Labor being the center-left party in Israel, that managed a peace treaty with Jordan. And then there was also, under a Labor-led government, the launch of the Oslo peace accords that attempted to set the stage for peace between Israel and the Palestinians. But along the way, there have been continuing attacks, either warlike attacks or terrorist attacks and waves of terrorism, sometimes quite intrusive into daily life in Israel. The first and second intifadas being the most notable examples of that. And so whether governments were left-leaning or right-leaning in Israel, they had to contend with this security environment. The last earlier war in Lebanon was an attempt to deal with incoming rocket fire from Lebanon, Hezbollah, into Israel, imperiling Israel's northern population centers, and the effort involved a substantial occupation of Lebanese territory, and then a decision that they weren't going to get what they wanted, so they drew back. But it marked a generation that is largely in leadership positions now in Israel, because people who fought in the Lebanon war during their mandatory military service for Jewish Israelis and many other and some other Israelis who do mandatory military service. So this security threat has marked Israel's entire modern history.
I'm going to interrupt. Sorry, because what I'm, because you're absolutely right.
Bring in Iran,
and we're limited.
I want to bring
time.
in.
But my question, my more immediate and my more immediate question is, what is the political corollary for the attack on Iran, the incursion into Lebanon? And, we can forget Gaza for a minute because that's I forgot the name of it, but there's a group that's meant to deal with it that it seems to me in recent times, Israel doesn't seem to be as attentive to harvesting political benefit from military activity. That's the part I just don't understand. I mean, did the Israelis really think there would be regime change in Iran because they bombed Iran? Or, that's the part I don't get.
So I have no doubt that there were hopes of that there may still be hopes of that in some circles in Israel, that there's hopes for regime change. But the primary military objective is to diminish or eliminate the threat from Iran. And the threat from Iran is multifaceted. It is not only the Iranian nuclear program, which, if fully achieved, would put Israel at existential risk, but also the Iranian missile program, which is seen in recent weeks, enables Iran to rain down missile fire on Israel. And over time, Israel's defenses would not be able to keep up in perpetuity because it takes more time to build more interceptors and acquire them. And so there's the missile threat, and then there's the proxy threat. And that relates to both Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon, particularly. And so there would not be a current Lebanon war had not Hezbollah leapt to the defense of its ally Iran, its funder and financial patron Iran, to attack Israel. And so, and by the way, the remarkable thing that's happening now, and the reason for hope, and this gets to your question, Jerry, there is hope for some breakthrough in Israel-Lebanon relations now. The fact that the Lebanese president has spoken to President Trump, that an Israeli and Lebanese delegation each came to Washington to meet, is a sign that the Lebanese government recognizes that Hezbollah is a problem for them, and that they've got to figure out a way to deal with it. Otherwise, they face the threat that Israel will continue to defend itself, defend its security interests, and do so on Lebanese soil, causing destruction and death and displacement in Lebanon. And so the fact that those talks are going on gives hope that there could be a breakthrough. And the last significant step in Lebanese-Israel relations was an arrangement to recognize informally a maritime boundary between the two countries, so that both countries, Israel and Lebanon, could exploit offshore oil and natural gas resources that were just in the area of that presumed boundary. And so that was under the Biden administration. Amos Hochstein was the mediator in that. This would be a bigger deal if there were a breakthrough that led to, and one of the challenges there was that the Lebanese government didn't want to engage in negotiations publicly with Israel because they were still in a state of war, but they did the deal anyway. Now, if there were an actual agreement for a lasting cessation of hostilities predicated on the disarmament of Hezbollah, that would be a transformation of the relationship and be part of this effort at normalizing relations between Israel and Arab countries, and beyond that, Muslim majority countries, marked by the Abraham Accords, building on the earlier Jordanian and Egyptian peace treaties. I'll pause there.
Thank you. Alan, I'm going to switch to, we're doing the I countries today, so I'm going to switch to Iran. I'm sure Jared and Steve have you on speed dial to get negotiating tips when they're talking to the Iranians. What advice would you give them so that perhaps, and J.D. Vance, so that perhaps the second round of negotiations will be more successful than the last? And the reason I'm asking you this question is, as you're both seasoned foreign service officers, knowing a great deal about your friends and your rivals obviously creates great expectations and an ability to be more successful. And so I'm curious. I was not surprised that the first negotiations failed. I don't have huge optimism that this time they'll be more successful. But what would you recommend if they were to have the wisdom to call you? What tips would you? And this is just based on someone who speaks Persian and knows Iranian culture and Iranian history really, really well.
Well, first, thanks for having me. And yeah, it's a real pleasure. I would, first of all, dispute your contention that the first rounds failed. They didn't fail. They were the first step. If you're walking from A to B and you take one step, you didn't fail to get to B. You just haven't gotten there yet. So again, they haven't failed. Secondly, I sort of it's not the case that there's such a thing called an Iranian mind, that where you get an expert who can sort of understand that unlocks the key. The reason that Iran and the U.S. have problems is not because essentially neither side understands the other. It's because they have mutually inconsistent and incompatible strategic objectives. So it's great knowing a lot about Iran, and it does help facilitate. But we were making progress in negotiations when Wendy Sherman was the head of the delegation, the single ablest negotiator I've ever worked under. She has no bupkis. She doesn't speak Persian, right? She doesn't know the difference. Well, again, she learned a lot. But my point is that that's not the secret sauce, okay? So what I would tell Mr. Kushner, Mr. Witkoff, Vice President Vance is try negotiating, because up until now, they haven't been negotiating. They've been waiting on the deck of the USS Missouri for Iran to capitulate to the terms they feel they have earned because they are militarily superior to Iran. They have fought because they beat Iran in a war militarily, that Iran has to bend the knee and kiss the ring and accede to and accept the maximalist, from Iran's point of view, goals that the U.S. is putting on the table. Negotiation is not bungee jumping, okay? It's a long, hard slog. So I would tell them to roll up their sleeves, extend their hotel stay, find a bunch of technical experts on sanctions and on nuclear issues, and be prepared to deal, because it's going to take a while. Reportedly, before this latest war, Mr. Witkoff said to President Trump, yeah, we could probably get a deal with Iran, but it would take months, as if that was too long a time to spend. From the start of nuclear negotiations to the end, 2010 to 2015, that was 5 years. 3 of those years were a waste of time because neither side was really ready to play. Even when they were, it took almost 2 years. So all I would tell the U.S. delegation is try negotiating.
One way, I guess the first session was not a failure because it led to a second. That's, that's reasonable. The Trump style of negotiating has been very effective with other countries. So the fact that it hasn't been effective with Iran, maybe all, negotiating partners are the same, but I tend to think that's probably not the case. But
who has it been effective with?
Sorry?
Who has the Trump style of negotiation been effective with?
I said it's not been effective.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said effective.
No. It's been.
I was looking for examples. Yeah. Okay.
No. I said it's not been effective. So it would, having, lived in Iran, there are certain, and again, I agree with you. There's certainly no such thing as an Iranian mind. And as you know, in LA, there's an obsession, Persian. Persians are only 60% of the population of Iran. So there are lots of other Iranian citizens who are culturally and historically different. My sense is that the Iranians are not going to take well to exactly what you said, which is to show up and negotiate without being willing to negotiate. And so I think you're 100% right. But what would you advise the Iranians if the Iranians were to call you and say, hey, Mr. Eyre, as a former, senior U.S. government official, what tips could you give us so that we could negotiate, not with the United States, but, with the Trump administration, which, has its idiosyncrasies, that might lead to a favorable outcome?
Well, I think to an extent, the Iranian administration gets President Trump. The problem with the people in Iran right now is Iran tends to avoid negotiating when it's too weak, because it feels that concessions made under pressure invite further aggression. This is a lesson they learned during the Iran-Iraq War. They learned it from Saddam, from Gaddafi, from the USSR, which is if you're under pressure and you concede, that's chum in the water. So already, whereas President Trump seems to assume Iran is weak, therefore we can get more, the opposite is true. Because Iran is weak, they're probably going to get less. Secondly, this current Iran is like a pinball machine, and it's in tilt. in the sense that they've lost a lot of their strategic leadership. Iran, as you know, has always had factional disputes, but there's always been the decider, as President Bush said, someone who says, there, this time, let's do it your way and not your way. That guy is dead. And the new guy is either dead or just hasn't amassed power, Mojtaba Khamenei. So the sort of Brownian motion of factional dispute in Iran has more than a normal consequence. It's not the case that Ghalibaf and Arakchi are the moderate good Iranians who we can do business with, as opposed to the mean, evil, hardline Iranians of Ahmad Vahidi and, Zolqadr and these people. It's a hardline government now. By decapitating Iran leadership, and you've got a more hardline, more militarized, IRGC dominant decision-making structure, of which Ghalibaf and Arakchi are a part. So the only thing I would tell Iranians, if they were to call me, and I hope they don't, because that would probably get me in trouble with the US government, is don't overplay your hand, because they have the upper hand now. Yeah, there's a blockade on Iran, but that's going to take time. And guess what? The Iranian government isn't facing midterms in November. Okay? If there's problems, they know how to put down popular unrest. Okay? Plus, they have now, thanks to President Trump, something they've never had, which is a turbocharged strategic deterrent. The nuclear program was a potential strategic deterrent because they don't have a nuclear weapon. Control of the Strait of Hormuz is a gift that keeps on giving. And every day that goes by with it being closed and Iran having control, the adverse economic consequences globally are compounding. So I would tell Iran, don't overplay your hand. You need to negotiate also because, and I'll finish here, not everything can be solved with negotiation. And to use a diplomatic phrase upside down, I'm cautiously pessimistic that a deal can be had. But you can't solve anything without negotiation.
Jonathan, I'm curious, what I read from the Israeli analytic community, my colleagues, our colleagues about Iran, is always, very, I always find it very compelling. Israel historically back in the day had a very close relationship with Iran, during the Shah's time. And Israel is obviously paying close attention to Iran. The question I can't figure, how does Israel have such unbelievably detailed intelligence about Iran? How do they know when so-and-so is going to be in such a, what's the, I know the good stuff you can't tell us, but, in a general sense for civilians, how is it that the Israelis know so much about Iran? What's the, to the degree that you can share that with us?
Right. So it's partly just going back to what I said earlier. Iran is, in Israel's view, Iran has been Israel's greatest threat. And that includes the threats from what they view as entirely Iranian proxy organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah, so Gaza and Lebanon. So getting to know your enemy is the center of intelligence community priorities in any country. So when we were in the Cold War, we wanted to know everything we could about the Soviet Union, and we had agents who were working to recruit spies from within the Soviet Union hierarchy to get the best information we could get on the Politburo, on the Soviet nuclear program, and so on. And the same is true for Israel. So they're just doing a really good job of that. And then beyond that, they have a lot of people who outside of government, maybe they started as analysts within government, but then in the think tank community, Iran has been a major focus of attention. And so they know a lot, and they're really good at it.
When you were in government with the Abraham Accord, I'm assuming that did this happen when you were in Israel?
I was the chargé d'affaires, the acting ambassador at the U.S. Embassy when the Abraham Accords were announced. That's because my ambassador was in Washington finalizing the deal. So yes, I was there from the get-go. The first leg of the Abraham Accords was the deal with the United Arab Emirates, followed not long after by the deal with Bahrain. I got to know both the Emirati and Bahraini ambassadors to Israel. Again, major breakthroughs when you think about it, that these were countries that had shunned Israel in every public forum, even though there had been quiet behind the scenes economic and political and intelligence contacts, but they couldn't publicly be seen with the Israelis, and they were ready to send ambassadors to Israel. They did settle in Tel Aviv, like almost all other countries' ambassadors, we being the first to make that breakthrough to move our embassy to Jerusalem, followed by a couple of small Central American countries, Honduras and Guatemala, and then later Kosovo, which is currently not a member of the United Nations. So we're in a small club, but a club that may grow over time.
But every one of these,
yeah, please.
I just want to ask another. Every one of the peace agreements between Israel, starting from Egypt and Jordan, all the way up to the Abraham Accords, they have been, am I correct? They've been very durable. I presume they disagree on this or that periodically, but they have stood the test of time, right? All of them.
Right.
All of them.
Right. That was driven home to me because I was also a chargé d'affaires between the Trump and Biden administrations. So I was the acting ambassador for the last Gaza conflict in 2021 in the spring, which lasted less than 2 weeks. But during that period, the Emirati ambassador and I were at briefings that the Israeli Foreign Ministry was hosting for foreign representatives. The Bahraini ambassador likewise did not get recalled. This more recent Gaza conflict did put more of a dent in the relationships, at least in the public-facing aspects. But still, you're right that these are enduring relationships. The relationship with yeah.
I was just going to say the one that's most trouble, which is not, is Turkey, which has always, had a diplomatic relationship and ups and downs. And Turkey is sort of more outspoken in its criticisms of Israel than, any of the Abraham Accords or even Egypt and Jordan, as far as I can tell.
Right. But that's because of a political transition in Turkey, lasting political transition, because Turkey was established essentially as a secular but Muslim state. So it was a secular state that happened to have a Muslim population. That's the way that Ataturk founded that country, the modern state of Turkey. But Erdogan has brought in a Muslim orientation to his political leadership that has also encompassed warm feelings towards Hamas in Gaza, including hosting Hamas leaders when they weren't in residence in Gaza. So yes, it's not surprising that relations with Turkey have been strained in the past decade.
Alan, I'm curious, is there any, did the Iranians feel that the Islamic Revolution of 1970, did they realize what a failure it was, or do they think that they, in terms of mobilizing the world and using Islam as a means of change and so forth? I mean, they have their, the Houthis and Hezbollah and others that they support, but are there other, anywhere in the Islamic world, does anybody look at Iran and think, wow, these, this is great. These people really accomplished anything. Do they feel that they've succeeded in the revolution, or do they realize that they haven't succeeded in terms of the broader Islamic world?
Well, I assume you're talking about the people running Iran, because obviously I can't make generalizations about 95 million Iranians, but certainly the people running Iran, and again, now it's largely the IRGC, feel that no, this is a constant battle. They feel that, Iran was a rejectionist anti-colonial power born in the 1970s, resisting, the imperial hegemony of the United States. And the United States, and again, using Iranian language, its proxy Israel, have been dedicated to the overthrow of the Islamic Republic. Now, as a practical matter, even that ideology has worn thin over the decades. One of the more interesting dynamics we see is that Iran has reverted to a foreign policy that's pretty much like the Shah of Iran, which is we're a 5,000-year-old civilization and you're not. So we get to be the regional hegemons because all you countries in the Gulf were created by Sykes-Picot and, the West. So there's a de facto nationalism that is pervasive in current Iranian foreign policy, as opposed to this pan-Islamic, we need to spread the Islamic Ummah, which pretty much died with Khomeini in 1989. So, yeah, I think that anyone with a brain and access to Google realizes the Islamic Republic is a failure, but still it's chugging along after 50 years. Again, don't forget, it really wasn't an Islamic revolution at first. It was a revolution, nationalists, socialists, communists, everybody. It's just that out of the tumult of those early years, the last man standing was the Islamic, were the Islamists. And they've slowly since then taken over power.
And I'm just curious, Israel would like to see regime change. The United States would like to see regime change. I would venture to say the vast majority of Iranians would like to see regime change. Is there any way to, what would it take for that to happen? Or is it simply not a possibility?
Again, the majority, again, I can't make generalization what the majority of Iranians want. Certainly the majority of Iranians are not happy with the current government. But then again, if you take polls in the United States, our current president has a popularity rating of 40%. And most Americans think that the Congress is worthless and the executive branch isn't doing the job either. So I don't think the U.S. is ripe for regime change. So yes, many, if not most of Iranians are deeply dissatisfied with their government, which they see as both incredibly incompetent and incredibly corrupt. Okay? But they also look around and see they're surrounded by failed states like Syria, almost Iraq, Yemen, Libya to an extent. So it's like that saying, better 1,000 nights of oppression than one night of anarchy, right? So especially when, here's the final point, there's no alternate regime in waiting that they can plug in, right? The alternative to this regime is chaos, because there are no institutions, there is no organized and effective opposition movement that could take the place of the current Islamic Republic. Now, there are tons of brave and effective oppositionists, both inside and outside Iran. There's no organized, effective opposition movement. Okay? So, yeah, regime change would be nice to a more user-friendly pro-West regime. It's just that takes time, organization, and those haven't happened yet. All we have is ambient anger, and that's a necessary but not sufficient condition.
Let me ask you both, if I may. Again, maybe I'm just showing my age, but when AID was basically closed down and Voice of America's broadcasting capabilities were dramatically shrunk, I felt that we were losing a very powerful soft power, but genuine international affairs tools. Is that just sort of a woo-woo California view, or had they still been assets that we could deploy, might the world look a little bit different, or this part of the world, the part of the world we're talking about? Jonathan, what do you think? I mean, it's you guys have both worked in so many parts of the U.S. government and spent so much of your lives living overseas. Did we lose something, or was this, the right decision? Jonathan,
Yeah,
I'll start with you.
happy to start. So, getting U.S. ideas out there was part of the job of Voice of America, but we continue to have the public diplomacy assets of the State Department, and the job of those components of the State Department and the officers at posts around the world are still there pushing American ideas out. The advantage of Voice of America was that it was a news source. So it was distinct from the embassy in a country. It was seen as a way to get news that was not state-run media in countries with controlled presses. So yes, we did lose something with the loss of Voice of America. We also lost a lot with the dissolution of USAID. We'll see whether the Trump administration is able to rebuild enough of a development assistance program. They've started with global public health arrangements, as well as continuing humanitarian assistance arrangements, without the benefit of having a freestanding agency to run those things outside of the State Department. But other countries have consolidated their development assistance with their foreign ministries, and still been able to do development. But we did close down a lot of programs in a lot of countries, billions and billions of dollars worth of programming. And those programs, the termination of those programs have immediate effects, including loss of public health assets, support for economic empowerment, support for democracy and governance. And if there were things that the current administration didn't like, they had the power as the government in charge to stop those particular activities or programs. It was not, in my view, necessary to eliminate the whole agency to adjust the operations to meet the current political leadership's priorities. I'll stop
Alan, what
there.
do you think? I mean, in terms of Iran, did we lose valuable tools, or not really? In other words, were the Iranians not really paying attention? They certainly couldn't get support from AID, but in terms of broadcasting and other, I've heard that the U.S. is smuggling Starlink panels into Iran to give people access to the internet and stuff like that. But is there something that we could have been doing that we're not doing that would make a difference? And if so, what might it be?
Oh, it's funny. Historically, U.S. influence in Iran started with missionaries, right? Who were, that was humanitarian work. It was only after World War II where the U.S. government really started paying attention to Iran, and then we started significantly increasing our military presence. Of course, we also had Point 4, which was help, but then again, we also helped create a famine in World War II when we invaded Iran to use it as a land bridge to resupply our allies. So we've always looked at Iran transactionally and sort of in terms of how we can use it. As you know, AID, obviously, since the revolution hasn't been there. So, yeah, in terms of VOA, again, just speaking from VOA Persian has always punched beneath its weight in Iran. There's a lot of reasons for that. But again, BBC Persia, in my opinion, always did a better job. And then what happened is you came along and you had these commercial services funded by different entities. You have Iran International, which has a very strong Gulf and royalist slant. You had Manoto from London, again, royalist slant. But, with the birth of the internet, Iran no longer necessarily needed Voice of America to put out its talking points. And in terms of getting the U.S. message out, my personal opinion is the Trump administration, has taken America first and made it America alone. It's eviscerated the State Department, denuded it of much of its expertise, and whatever residual expertise is in the State Department is ignored. U.S. foreign policy now is done by 4 or 5 people, who are close to President Trump. So getting America's message out, unfortunately, is working, but the message that's getting out, I don't think is one conducive to America's continued global leadership.
Jonathan, any any thoughts on that? I would be curious. I'm not pushing back. I'm curious what you think. Jonathan, you're on mute. Sorry.
On the question of the loss of AID and its impact on U.S. global leadership, yes, it matters. It matters because assistance is one of the tools of influence with countries. It's a question of whether we use it. And historically, we have varied in that because if the assistance is purely seen as purely a matter of doing the right thing, helping the needy, and so on, it doesn't necessarily influence governments, some of whom are just as happy to have somebody else pay the bill for their domestic social programs. And if they can get some skim off of that through means fair or foul, so much the better for them. But it is undoubtedly true that countries that were receiving U.S. assistance knew it, the populations knew it, and it led to better attitudes towards the United States. Now, given my last posting, the Trump administration has cited the failure of countries to vote with us at the UN, even if they receive our assistance, as being part of the reason why the old model of U.S. assistance wasn't working. There's a disconnect in many capitals between their foreign policy with the world and their foreign policy in multilateral organizations. And sometimes multilateral organizations are used as a forum for venting or blowing off steam, and not for telling it like it really is, so that countries, to cite the example of the Abraham Accord countries, representatives at the UN would criticize Israel's behavior in Gaza, even though they had good bilateral relationships nonetheless. So there's often that disconnect between multilateral fora and other aspects of a country's foreign policy.
Let me ask you both the same question with a sort of blank in the middle. And the blank is, I'll start with you, Alan. There is a very, very large emigre Iranian population in the United States. And there's actually a sociologist at UCLA who studies the Iranian American community, and every time they quote him, I pay a lot of attention because it's much more diverse and varied and so forth than I think people realize. But both the Iranian American community and the Jewish American community are sort of domestic populations with a special interest in countries to whom in the Iranian case, they originated in Iran. In the Jewish American case, they have very special, close spiritual and perhaps other ties. I'm curious, Alan, I'll start with you. Does the Iranian American community, and again, I know this is not your domain, but you do live here and you are an expert on Iran, do they have a voice on, other than, demonstrating in front of the federal building in Westwood, do they have a coherent, I don't want to use the word unified because I know it's not unified, but some voice that will affect U.S. policy? And I'm going to ask Jonathan the same question about, the American Jewish community. But, Alan, what do you think? I mean, you must encounter Iranian Americans, with some regularity. You used to live in L.A. Is there something going on there that the U.S. government pays attention to, should pay attention to, or is it as sort of disaggregated as Iranians in Iran itself?
No, I mean, first of all, the gentleman you mentioned at UCLA, Kayvon Harris, is very
That's
good.
right. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's the guy.
yeah. Part of mine. He's very, very sharp on that.
Yeah.
It's funny. You put two diaspora Iranians in a room, and you'll have three different points of view. It's unbelievable that they just can't get along. So they have an influence in U.S. politics, and that because it's the part of the elephant that U.S. policymakers could touch, right? So everyone has an Iranian friend. The challenge is that those Iranians don't represent Iranians in Iran necessarily. Obviously, many of them have a family and friends back there, but the fact that they're here shows they're not a random sampling of Iranians overall. They certainly have a right to have an influence in the future of their homeland, but they're not necessarily the best reflectors of realities of what's going on in Iran. Right. So, yes, they have access to policymakers. They're organized. There's two main organizations representing Iranian Americans, one of which is very divisive in the expatriate Iranian community, NIAC, the National Iranian American Council. I think that's the title. Unfortunately, again, like VOA Persian, the diaspora Iranians are punching below their weight. They're very successful. Many of them are professionals. They're a credit both to Iran and to the U.S. But in terms of getting effective help to the forces in Iran that are fighting for a positive change, I just don't think that they're doing all they can. And that's largely a question of they're not working with each other.
Right. Interesting. Jonathan, the first time Alan said, you get two in a room and you get three opinions. The first time I heard that expression was related to, I think it was either American Jews or Israelis. I can't remember. So it's a similar phenomenon. But what do you think? In turn, I'm not an expert in this, so I would be curious.
Sure. So there are two distinct communities we should touch on. One is Israeli Americans living in the United States, and that's less than 200,000 people. So it's not a significant political force, but they are here and they have a voice and they're free to write to their members of Congress and show up at presidential campaign events and so on. But there is a substantially larger American Jewish community, the overwhelming majority of whom are supportive of the state of Israel's existence, but of diverse views on any given Israeli government's policies. I only wish there were just two main organizations to sort out. There are dozens, to the point that one organization came along after negotiations among a number of the organizations to establish the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations, which has dozens of member organizations. And the implication is that there are minor Jewish American organizations beyond the major ones. But there is a kind of a mainstream, a just beyond the mainstream view, and then a small minority view. And so depending on where you are, you may want to draw from one or more of those perspectives. But the mainstream American Jewish organizations are supportive of the attempt to diminish the threat from Iran, including the current conflict, but in general, diminishing the threat to Iran because it's seen as an existential threat to Israel, and the recognition that as it's styled, the tentacles of Iran extend far beyond the Middle East region. So attacks on Jewish communities attempted in the United States, affected in places like Argentina and elsewhere. And so that's kind of the mainstream American Jewish perspective on the current conflict in Iran and the ongoing, the long-standing differences with Iran. But there are voices within the organized Jewish community that oppose the war in Iran, the war with Iran, and others that are focused on establishing a state of Palestine and those segments are ready to recognize the state of Palestine. But those are in a distinct minority among the organized American Jewish community.
And there's an additional element on the Israel side that doesn't exist on the Iranian side, which is American religious groups. I'm telling our watchers today, I was telling Jonathan Allen I'm giving a talk at the Nixon Library on Iran day after tomorrow, and Mike Huckabee is going to be giving us some remarks from Jerusalem. So there's a whole community of Christian Americans who have a particular interest in Israel and a particular view of Israel who also have a voice. Iran doesn't yet have that. I don't think there are non-Iranian Americans who have maybe I'm wrong, but have a special interest in Iran. But I regard sorry, go ahead, please.
I would just observe that the Christian, especially Christian evangelical supporters of Israel, maybe they are at least as influential in American politics and with Congress as the Jewish American community.
Yeah. I'm curious, are they fairly unified as a group, or are they as divided as every other group? The ones Alan mentioned are divided. The Jewish groups you've mentioned are divided. Are the Christian groups equally as divided, or?
My observation from encountering them during my time in Israel is that they are there will be bickering among groups, organizations. That's why there are different organizations instead of everyone joining one. But their policy perspectives among Christian supporters, Christian organizations that are supportive of Israel, is a remarkable degree of alignment.
Got it. Gentlemen, I think our time is at an end. I've been peeking at the questions from our members and salting my questions with questions and comments and observations that they've made. Jonathan, I want to apologize for shortening your career by at least a decade. Fortunately, I'm not in the pension-paying department of the U.S. government, or this would have been a costly mistake. I really want to thank you both for your service to our country, and I really mean that. We're always thanking military people at airports. I don't think people understand what a challenging, difficult profession you've chosen for yourselves. I think it's like journalism. There are certain professions that when you start out, they look different. I'm an academic, so being a professor today isn't what it was after I got my PhD and got my job at Michigan, and I was so excited. So diplomacy, U.S. government in general, journalism, academia, these things have changed in ways that I think is a net loss for our country. So I really want to thank you both, not only for your service to our country, but for doing what you're doing now, which is sharing your wisdom and your insights with the American people, because I think it's really, really important that they hear from you both and all of your colleagues. So I hope we can call on you again. I'd like to do this with you in person, and I wish you well and a good day. And all of our webinar participants, thank you for joining us as well. Take care.